She was still laughing when the engine caught. That was the part she could never explain later to the people who asked. That she had been standing 20 feet away on the tarmac with her hand over her mouth, genuinely amused, watching an old beat-up Cessna fail to start for the third time. And then she blinked and the engine was running. A deep, alive roar that rolled across the grass strip and hit her in the chest. And the man at the controls taxied to the runway and lifted off, clean and steady, and climbed into the Montana sky while she stood there with her smile still on her face and nothing, suddenly, to put it on. It had taken him 3 minutes. 3 minutes while she laughed, while her own charter sat on the ground with a cracked fuel line and her board meeting was 200 miles away in a valley only reachable by air. And the only other operable plane at Harlan County Airstrip was already vanishing into the clouds above the Rockies with the only pilot she hadn't bothered to introduce herself to. She had laughed, and now she needed him. And that gap between the laugh and the needing was the most expensive 3 minutes of her professional life and the most important 36 hours of her personal one. Tell me where you're watching from. This one goes up. Nora Slade had not been on a small plane in 27 years, and she had engineered her entire adult life around making sure it stayed that way. This was not something she discussed. There are things a CEO cannot say to her board, cannot say to the journalists who write about her, cannot say to the assistant who books her travel. And the thing Nora Slade could not say was that she was afraid of flying, specifically of small aircraft, specifically of the kind that are flown out of grass strips by men in Carhartt jackets with coffee thermoses and logbooks that look like something out of the previous century. She was not afraid of commercial jets. She had made her peace with commercial jets a long time ago on the basis that they were large and institutional and staffed by people who had passed rigorous exams, which was the same basis on which she trusted hospitals and banks. But a small plane, a single-engine prop plane, the kind that sounds like a lawnmower and bounces in turbulence and has no co-pilot and lands on grass, was not a managed, institutional risk. It was a guess with wings. And Nora Slade did not fly on guesses. She had built a career, a considerable one, on exactly that principle. She was the CEO of a medical supply company called Aldous Health, mid-sized, profitable, quietly essential. The kind of company that stocked remote clinics and rural hospitals with the things that kept people alive when the nearest city was 4 hours off. She had run it for 12 years, and in 12 years she had grown it from 40 employees to 800, and from 3 regional warehouses to a network that reached into places where the road ended and the river began. She was good at it. She was, her competitors would grudgingly allow, the best cold chain logistics executive in the Mountain West, with a gift for moving supplies into places that didn't want to be reached by the ordinary infrastructure of the country. She knew every route, every shortcut, every favored contractor. What she did not know, and what her people knew better than to point out, was that her gift for routing had always been shaped, at its edges, by the particular corners of the map where you could only get there by small aircraft, and that she had never once gone to any of them herself. She routed her own travel with the same precision she routed cold chain shipments. And the rule was simple. If it requires a prop plane, we solve it by another means. 27 years was a long time to hold a rule. She had engineered it with the same precision she applied to cold chain logistics, which was to say invisibly and completely. Her travel profile contained no record of an aversion. It simply contained preferred routes that happened never to require a prop plane. Her assistant had been booking her flights for 6 years and had never once been asked to charter a small aircraft. The need had never presented itself, because she had structured the territories of her company, quietly and over years, so that the places you could only reach by single-engine aircraft were the places she sent other people. She employed 2 dedicated field managers whose entire jobs she had, in her own private accounting, engineered partly around the fact of her own immovable no. She had been inside a helicopter once, for a site visit she couldn't delegate. She had lasted 4 minutes on the ground and discovered that the helicopter was different from the Cherokee, enclosed, engineered, no visible propeller blurring its own vulnerability in plain sight. And she had managed just, but she had not done it again. And she had noted the distinction the way you note the exact parameter of a thing you are afraid of, because precision about the boundary lets you keep the boundary clean. It was not irrational to her. It was arithmetic. She knew the accident statistics for small general aviation aircraft better than most pilots did, because she had researched them once, searching for the argument that would let her stop being afraid, and had found instead the argument that confirmed her caution and had closed the tab and filed the fear under reasonable. What she had not researched, because research was for things you intended to change, was the other number, the number of landings that pilots of light aircraft completed safely on ordinary days, in ordinary weather, in ordinary passes through ordinary mountains. That number was not in her file. She had not needed it. She had been too careful for too long to be in a position where she needed it. Until today. She had held it since she was 18, since a June afternoon in a pasture in Oregon when her father's Piper Cherokee had come down hard in a field after an engine failure, and she had sat in the right seat for the longest 45 seconds of her life, watching her father's hands on the controls and thinking, this is it. This is where the thing ends. Before the nose came up and the wheels thumped the ground and they rolled to a stop between the rows of a wheat field, and sat there in the silence of two people who had just negotiated with the ground and won. Nobody was hurt. Her father had flown again the following Saturday because he was that kind of man and had invited her to come, and she had smiled and said maybe next time, and there had never been a next time, and neither of them had ever once said out loud what that afternoon had cost her. That was the Slade family's way. The thing that needs saying is usually the thing that goes unsaid, in the interest of everyone's comfort, until it has been unsaid so long that saying it feels impossible. Nora's father was 72 now and still flew, and she had not been in a small plane since she was 18, and they had never once spoken about the wheat field, and the silence between them had the specific weight of a thing that has been held too long in one position. All of this had nothing to do with Harlan County, Montana, on a cold Tuesday in October, except that it had everything to do with it, the way the true stories are never about what they appear to be about, and the way the things we carry without looking at them always find their moment. The situation was this. Aldous Health supplied the Harlan Valley Medical Center, a small clinic 40 air miles south of the airstrip, which could be reached by car in summer and not at all in a normal Montana October, when the mountain pass that was the only road alternative closed on its own schedule with no regard for anyone's board meetings. The clinic was overdue on a resupply, an unusual delay caused by a contractor dispute that Nora had let run too long, and the clinic's head physician had called Nora's personal cell the previous week and said, with the calm of a person who has learned to ration urgency, that they were 8 days from running out of epinephrine. And Nora had heard that word, epinephrine, and understood that a clinic without epinephrine in a valley that took 40 minutes by air to reach was a place where the next anaphylactic shock became a death, and she had done what she almost never did, which was to go herself. She had chartered a Pilatus PC-12 out of Missoula, a proper single-turbine aircraft with a professional operator and a certified pilot and a fuel range that gave her 3 options for the return trip. She had done the sensible, institutional, risk-managed thing. And then, 2 hours before departure, her pilot had called to report a cracked fuel line found in pre-flight, and the replacement part was in Missoula, and the repair was a same-day job, and the PC-12 was on the ground. Her assistant had tried, in the 40 minutes that followed, every charter operator within range of Harlan County. The answer was the same from all of them. Not today, not with this weather window and this notice. The pass would close in the morning. The clinic was 8 days from epinephrine. And Nora Slade, who had avoided small aircraft for 27 years with a precision that would have impressed an air traffic controller, found herself standing on a grass strip in western Montana with nowhere to go, and a problem she had never let herself be close enough to have. That was when she saw the Cessna. He had been coming to Harlan County Airstrip for 6 years, roughly every second Tuesday, with supplies for the Harlan Valley Clinic. He did not do it for Aldous Health. He had never heard of Aldous Health. He did it because a backcountry pilot with a capable plane and a regular route through that part of Montana runs into a rural clinic eventually, and because he had asked once whether they needed things, and they had said yes, and because once Nate Holt understood something was needed, he did not have the machinery to say no. He carried whatever fit in the Cessna's cargo hold. Medicines, once in a while, more often dry goods, and mail, and last spring, a pregnant Labrador for the rancher's family that had no other way to get the dog to the vet in time. He did not charge for it. He had a day job. He flew charter freight out of Missoula 3 days a week, enough to keep the mortgage and the hangar and Owen's school supplies. And the Tuesday clinic run was the other thing. The one he did because Lucy had taught him that you use whatever you have to close whatever gap is in front of you, and he had a plane and there was a gap, and so. He arrived at Harlan County that Tuesday morning the way he always did. A little before 9 in his truck, with Owen in the passenger seat and a Stanley thermos of black coffee in the cup holder and the back of the truck loaded with supplies. Owen was 7, and on the Tuesdays that were teacher-in-service days, which this one was, he came along, because Nate had made an assessment years ago that a 7-year-old who spent his Tuesdays in a hangar learning to pre-flight an airplane was getting an education that nothing in the state curriculum was going to match for usefulness, and because Owen, for his part, would rather be at the airstrip than anywhere on Earth. Owen had a notebook. He kept it in the truck's glove box, between an expired sectional chart and a packet of peanut butter crackers, and in it he drew clouds. Not in an artistic way, in a taxonomic way, the way a small scientist records specimens. He had the names memorized, the cumulus and the cirrus and the stratus and the nimbostratus, and the special ones, the ones that required a mountain to make them. The lenticular clouds that built in standing waves downwind of a peak and sat there like a stack of enormous plates and could, if you flew into the turbulence under them without knowing what they were, shake a plane apart. Arthur's grandfather had taught Owen the lenticular last winter, on a clear day when 3 of them were stacked over the western range in a textbook formation. Those, Nate had said, are the clouds that look like they're not doing anything. They're doing the most. Always give them room. Owen had drawn them for a week. He still pointed them out every time he saw them, which was fairly often in this part of Montana, and Nate always looked, and every time he thought. The boy understood on the first telling the thing that takes most pilots 3 years to learn. The plane was a 1966 Cessna 185 Skywagon, white with a blue stripe, and it was the thing that had ended Nate's marriage to everything he'd been before Lucy died. He had been a commercial airline captain, a career that had started at 23 on a regional turboprop, and arrived by 38 at the left seat of a long-haul wide body, flying routes that crossed oceans, logging blocks of time in the sky that measured in years rather than hours. It was a good career. It was, in the way of good careers, consuming the schedules that 8 weeks, the 16-day pairings, the hotel rooms in cities that blurred together, the birthdays missed and the Christmases negotiated. He had managed all of it, accepted all of it, the way the pilots of his generation were taught to accept it, because the sky was its own reward, and because Lucy had been, for 12 years, the kind of woman who made the coming home worth the going away. Lucy had died on a Tuesday of a brain aneurysm at 37, while Nate was over the Pacific in the right kind of unreachable. By the time the airline had found a way to get him home, Owen was 3 days old and his wife was already gone, and the man who got off the plane was not the same man who had gotten on it. He had flown one more trip, 2 months later, more out of inertia than intention, and in the middle of the ocean, at 35,000 feet, with the autopilot holding the plane and the cabin dark around him, and his mind 4,000 miles behind him in a house that smelled like a woman who was no longer in it. He had understood with a clean, quiet certainty that he was done. Not done flying, flying was the one thing grief had not been able to reach, which he would spend years being grateful for, but done with the kind of flying that required him to be away. Done with the pairings and the hotels and the schedule that made a father into a visitor. He had landed the plane, filed his resignation, and come home. He had found the 185 the following spring. It had been sitting in an estate sale, technically flyable but not recently flown, needing the kind of attention that only someone who was going to love it would give it. A full annual, new cylinders, rewiring, fabric on the tail feathers. He had spent 4 months on it in a rented hangar, with Owen in a bouncy chair growing slowly into a sitting baby and then a crawling one. And when he climbed in and started the engine for the first time after the rebuild, the sound it made was the sound of a thing brought back from the edge of being lost. And something in Nate Holt, something that had been quiet since the Pacific, woke back up. There had been a morning, 3 weeks into the rebuild, when Owen was asleep in the car seat in the truck beside the rented hangar and Nate had sat on an overturned bucket and looked at the half-stripped airframe and tried to understand why he was doing it. He had the money to buy a newer plane. He had the background to know exactly what a 30-year-old airframe with corroded control cables and a worn-out engine was going to cost him in time and parts. There was no rational argument for the 185, and he had spent 6 months unable to make himself look at a newer plane, and he understood, sitting on the bucket while Owen slept, that the not looking was its own answer. He needed a thing that needed him. He needed a project that was going to take everything he had, because everything he had was, at that moment, grief and time, and a set of skills that had nowhere useful to go. and a plane that would fly when he was done was a better use of all three than the alternatives. He also needed the particular kind of faith that a rebuilt engine requires. The faith of a man who has taken a thing apart to the last piece and put it back together with his own hands and knows, in the way you only know from having done it, exactly why it works and exactly what it will do. He needed to be, for the first time in a long time, the person who understood why something worked from the inside out, rather than the person who was trying to trust that it would. The airline had given him everything except that. A commercial jet works because 1,000 engineers and a maintenance regime and a regulatory framework have decided it will, and you operate it by trusting the system. Nate Holt, in the year after Lucy died, was a man who could no longer trust systems on faith. He needed the kind of knowledge that came from his own hands on the thing. He needed a Cessna 185 that he had rebuilt himself, that owed its airworthiness to no one but him, that he could look at from the ground and know, I made that flyable. I know why it flies. I will know if it ever stops. The plane was his now. It looked rough to anyone who didn't know it. The paint was weathered to a soft chalk by years of Montana sun. The cowling had a small dent on the left side that he'd never got around to pulling, and the interior smelled of avgas and old leather, and the particular warmth of a cabin that has been well used in all weather. But the engine was immaculate, and the airframe was sound, and it flew the way a working tool should fly, honestly, without drama, and with a competence that had nothing to do with how it appeared. Nate had a rule about it that was also a rule about a great many other things. What a thing looks like on the outside is the last thing that matters, and the first thing most people look at, and the gap between those two facts is where nearly all the trouble in the world lives. Owen was in the grass at the edge of the tarmac looking at the sky when Nora Slade first saw them. She was standing by her grounded PC-12, talking to her assistant on her phone, going through the list of charter operators her assistant had already exhausted, and she saw the truck pull in, a Ford with rust through the rockers and a banged-up topper on the bed, the kind of truck that looks like it has a story, and she saw the man get out, tall, about 40. A faded Carhartt work jacket, and a baseball cap with no logo and the unhurried walk of someone who has been doing this particular thing for years and has long since stopped performing it for anyone. And she saw the boy, who had climbed out of the passenger side and immediately sat down cross-legged in the grass and tilted his face up at the sky and was, as far as Nora could see, talking to himself about the clouds. She did not find this charming. She was a CEO on a deadline with a cracked fuel line and nowhere to go, and charm was not on her list of usable assets that morning. The man walked to the old white and blue Cessna at the far end of the line, opened the cowling, did a thorough walk around with the kind of attention that takes its time and does not hurry for an audience, and then climbed into the left seat. Nora watched not because she was interested, but because there was nothing else to watch and she was out of phone calls to make, and her body had the fidgety, barely controlled energy of a person who manages fear by staying in motion and had just run out of motion. The Cessna's engine turned over. Once, twice, caught briefly and quit. The engine turned over again, and did not catch, and the sound of it, the mechanical gasp, the failure to ignite, the flat silence after, hit Nora Slade in the chest in a way she had not expected, in a way she would have needed to be honest with herself to explain. And so she did what she had always done instead of explaining, which was to laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was not meant as a cruelty, but it came out as a short, surprised laugh that came from the throat rather than the chest, the laugh of a person who is more frightened than amused and has reached for the wrong response in the dark, and it was perfectly audible in the still Montana morning. The man in the cockpit did not look at her. The boy in the grass did. He looked at her with the direct, unblinking attention of someone who has been taught that a person who laughs at a struggling plane is either frightened or rude, and that either one deserves to be taken seriously. He did not say anything. He just looked. 3 minutes. Nate Holt got out of the plane, opened the cowling again, did one specific thing to the primer. The engine had flooded. A known tendency of this particular model in cold weather that any pilot who'd flown a carbureted Lycoming for more than a season would have recognized instantly. Vented it, closed the cowling, climbed back in, and went through the start sequence. The engine caught cleanly, running up to a deep, steady idle, and the sound of it filled the whole airstrip. He ran through his checks. He taxied to the runway threshold. He looked right and left and right again, not at her, not at the runway exactly, at the sky, reading it the way the people who fly low and slow learn to read it, as a live and variable thing. And he pushed the throttle forward and the 185 rolled and lifted and climbed and was gone. The whole thing had taken 11 minutes from truck to wheels up. 3 of them had been the fix. Nora stood on the empty tarmac and watched the plane become a speck and then a nothing in the enormous Montana sky, and felt, along with the precise professional dread of a missed meeting and a clinic without epinephrine, the smaller and more difficult feeling of a woman who has just behaved badly and knows it, and who has simultaneously just watched the last possible solution to her morning fly away without her. Her assistant called back with the same answer as before. There were no other options. There was no charter within range. There was no road to the clinic until spring. There was the plane that had just left. Nora Slade, for the first time in 12 years of running a company, stood on a piece of ground and had no move to make. And then, because she had built 12 years of moves on the principle that there is always another move if you are willing to be the one to make it, she did the only thing left. She walked over to the boy who was still sitting in the grass naming clouds, and she crouched down to his level, which she almost never did, and she said, "That man who just flew away, do you know when he's coming back?" The boy looked at her with serious dark eyes. "That's my dad," he said. "He'll be back around noon. He's just delivering stuff." He tilted his head. "Why were you laughing at his plane?" Nora Slade, who had not been caught genuinely off-footed by another person's directness in a very long time, had no immediate answer. "I think I was nervous," she said, which was the first true thing she had said out loud that day, which was, in the way of true things said accidentally, the beginning of everything that came after. She waited. She was not accustomed to waiting. Waiting was, in Nora Slade's working life, a failure of preparation, something that happened to people who had not thought far enough ahead. She had structured her entire career to eliminate it. And here she sat, on an overturned fuel drum at the edge of a grass strip in western Montana, with her laptop balanced on her knees and her phone burning through calls she'd already made, and a boy named Owen sitting 6 feet away comparing the clouds to his notebook with the focused enjoyment of someone who had all the time there was. She tried every alternative again, more slowly, in the hope that a different pace would produce a different answer. It did not. The pass was scheduled to close by midnight and would not reopen until spring. That was not a forecast, that was a geological fact. The mountain was simply a mountain, and the mountain did not care about her board meeting or her clinic. The turboprop sat on the tarmac with its cracked fuel line and would be flyable by tomorrow afternoon, which was tomorrow afternoon and not today. There was no helicopter within the operational range, weather, and pricing she could authorize. There was no other chartered fixed wing available on the day in this part of the state for any price. She had, in 4 hours of trying, conclusively proved what she had been circling since the PC-12 grounded. There was one way to get to the Harlan Valley Clinic today, and it had taken off without her. She had 2 conversations during that wait that she would remember, not for what they produced, because neither produced anything, but for what they showed her about the particular kind of position she was in. The first was with her regional VP, who took her situation in grounded charter closed pass, 1 operational aircraft, pilot unknown to the company, and said, with the measured delivery of a person delivering bad news to a CEO, that the board meeting could be rescheduled, that the clinic resupply could wait for the PC-12's repair, and that the responsible thing was to stay grounded. It was a reasonable assessment. It was, by every risk management rubric Nora had ever applied, the correct call. She thanked him, hung up, and did not follow it, because she had watched a nurse named Pat receive a supply box with the specific relief of someone who had been watching the shelf get short, and the rubric she had been running for 27 years had failed to include Pat in the calculation. The second was with her assistant, who made one more pass through the charter landscape with the tenacity of someone who has worked for Nora Slade for 6 years and knows that there must be something is not a request but a structural belief about the universe. There was nothing. The assistant reported this with the careful neutrality of a person who hates to be the message, and Nora said, "I know. I found my one option this morning." "Thank you," and ended the call, and sat with the specific quality of silence that arrives when all the alternatives have been honestly exhausted, and only the true answer remains. At 11:50, she heard the 185 before she saw it. The sound came from the south, low and clear in the cold air. That specific resonance of a Lycoming engine at cruise power that she recognized from 27 years of carefully not listening for it. And the plane appeared over the tree line and made a clean left base and touched down on the grass with a squeak and a rumble and rolled to the apron, and Nate Holt cut the engine. She stood up. Her hands were cold and she had drunk too much of the bad diner coffee the FBO offered, and her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was managing something she did not want to be managing. She told herself, walking toward him as he climbed out and reached back into the cargo area for the empty crates, that this was simple. She needed a pilot. He was a pilot. She had money and he presumably had a price, and that was a soluble problem. She had solved harder ones before 10 o'clock on worse mornings. And then Owen came running from wherever he'd been, in the grass at the runway edge, and launched himself at his father's waist. And Nate Holt caught the boy with one arm without looking up from the crate he was stacking. The automatic, practiced catch of a parent who has done it 10,000 times and whose body no longer needs to think about it. And something in that small gesture, that unself-conscious one-armed catch, slowed Nora down without her permission. And she arrived at the conversation with less of herself organized than she'd intended. "Mr. Holt," she said. He straightened and looked at her, and she saw that he had the kind of face that had decided years ago not to perform anything for anyone, which was either dullness or depth, and she had already learned this morning that she was wrong about which one. "My name is Nora Slade. I'm the CEO of Aldous Health. We supply the Harlan Valley Clinic. I believe you fly there." "I do," he said. He had a quiet, level voice, and it did not change when he recognized her, which meant he had seen her on the tarmac that morning and had filed her away. "Ms. Slade, I need to get there today. My charter is grounded with a fuel line issue. There is no other aircraft available. I understand the pass closes tonight." She said it plainly, without inflection, the way she delivered information she had already processed. "I'd like to hire you to fly me. I'll pay your standard charter rate or above it, whatever is fair." Nate Holt set down the crate. He looked at her steadily for a moment, the same way his son had looked at her that morning from the grass, and she understood it was a family look, a look that was doing something quiet and thorough behind the stillness. "You laughed," he said, not accusatory, the same register he used for everything, a statement about the record. "I know," Nora said. "You don't owe me a flight, I know that." "I'm asking anyway." A beat. "The clinic has 8 days of epinephrine left. The next supply window after today is spring. I'm not asking for myself." She watched him consider it. Or she would come to understand later, consider not the facts, which he had already processed, but the person in front of him, the way he considered everything, which was without hurry and without the kind of surface reading that most people substitute for the real thing. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the plane that morning, the way he looked at the sky before he turned onto the runway, like someone reading a live and variable thing that required actual attention. "Owen," he said, "go ask Mrs. Burrows if she can take you for the afternoon." Owen looked at his father, then at Nora, then back at his father, and his dark eyes did a rapid private calculation. "The lady's scared," Owen said, not meanly, as a diagnostic finding. "I can tell from how she's standing. She's been standing like that all morning." "I know," Nate said. "You should still take her," Owen said with the decisive authority of 7. "She needs to go. Also, she said the right thing about the laughing. She said she was nervous." He looked at Nora. "That was the true one. The true answer is the one that works." And Nate Holt looked at his son for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that Nora Slade would think about for a long time afterward. "It generally is," he said. "Go on." Owen went, and Nate Holt picked up his keys and his thermos and said, "An hour to refuel and file. I'll knock on the FBO door when I'm ready." And he walked toward the fuel pump, and Nora Slade stood on the tarmac for a moment with the afternoon wind off the mountains moving across the empty grass and the faint smell of 100 LL in the cold air. And she did a thing she had not done in a professional context in a very long time. She breathed. The pre-flight took 20 minutes and she watched all of it. She had not meant to watch. She had intended to stand inside the FBO with her laptop open and manage her afternoon from a distance, preserving the professional separation between herself and the thing she was about to do, which was to get into a 30-year-old propeller airplane and fly 40 miles through a mountain corridor in Montana with a man she had laughed at 3 hours ago. Managing from a distance was a skill she had. But Nate had come to the FBO door after filing and said, "You want to watch the pre-flight?" And it had not come out as a question, which was odd, and she had found herself standing on the tarmac in the wind. Before that, though, there was the waiting, the hour and a half between the engine catching and the pre-flight. And it was the longest 90 minutes of Nora's professional year, because there was nothing to do during it except sit with the decision she had made. And every minute of sitting with it showed her something she had been successfully not seeing for 27 years, which was how large the fear actually was now that it was no longer being managed by distance. She had been managing it with distance for so long that she had stopped knowing the exact shape of it. Now, sitting on the fuel drum watching Nate refuel the 185 with a pump that accepted a credit card, just like a gas station, except that the fuel it dispensed was 100 LL Aviation gasoline with a faint blue tint, she could feel the exact shape of it, which was old. The fear was old, and she had simply been keeping it company at a distance without ever looking it in the face. The way you can keep company with a debt by not opening the envelope. And what she was finding, now that she was going to have to open the envelope regardless, was that the debt was not as large as the not opening had made it. It was real. It was 27 years old, and it lived in a wheat field in Oregon, and it had been shaping every route she'd ever drawn, and it was real. But it was also just a thing that had happened on a June afternoon, and the plane had landed, and the landing had worked, and she had been 19 years old for all of one more summer after that and was now 45. And the woman on the fuel drum was not the girl in the right seat, and a great deal had happened in the intervening time to suggest that she was, on balance, a person who could handle the things that happened to her. She was still afraid. She went into the plane afraid, but she went. He went through the airplane the way she imagined surgeons go through a pre-surgical checklist, not perfunctorily, not quickly, but with the particular attention of someone for whom the steps are second nature, and who performs them anyway because the point of a checklist is that it does not depend on memory. He checked the fuel in both tanks, sumped for water, checked the oil, walked the control surfaces, checked the tires, tested the fuel vents, looked at the pitot tube, tested the lights. He did it in silence, and when he finished, he turned to her and said, "Any questions?" She had 100 questions, and all of them were about the same thing, and none of them were about the plane. She asked the one she could manage. "How long have you been flying this one?" 6 years, he said. He put his hand flat on the cowling for a moment, a brief, unremarkable gesture, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching, and that Nora Slade, who was watching, did not miss. "She belonged to a guy in Glacier County before me. I rebuilt her." "You rebuilt the engine yourself?" "And most of the rest of her. She needed it." He glanced at Nora in the way she was coming to recognize the level look that assessed without performing the assessment. "She looks rough. She flies clean. Those are usually the same plane." Nora was quiet for a moment. "The start this morning," she said. "What was it?" "Flooded, cold morning, primer heavy start. Once the fuel vents, she catches." He closed the cowling. "Happens once in a while. I know the sequence. Takes about 3 minutes." Nora Slade looked at the plane. It sat on the tarmac in the flat mountain light, white paint chalked by years of sun, the small dent on the cowling she'd noticed in the morning, the old-style antennas, a Garmin GPS mounted in the panel that was newer than anything else in the cockpit, and that Nate had clearly added himself. It did not look like the kind of aircraft that the CEO of a medical supply company should be entrusting her morning to. And then she thought about what was on the other side of the mountains, and about epinephrine, and about a clinic that would be 8 days from empty by the time she landed if she did not go today. And she thought about the wheat field in Oregon when she was 18, and her father's hands on the controls, and she thought, all of it, the whole accumulated weight of 27 years of not going, and this is the morning it comes due. "Ready when you are," she said. She climbed in. The cabin smelled of avgas and old leather and something else, something lower and warmer, the smell of a place that has been lived in from the inside, the smell of a thermos and a packed lunch and a boy who fell asleep against the window on the way home. There was a logbook in the pocket on the back of the co-pilot's seat. She did not look at it. Nate climbed in beside her, buckled, picked up his headset, handed her the spare. She put it on. The engine started on the first try, the primer sequence done exactly right, and the sound inside the cabin was close and immediate. Nothing like a jet, nothing like something managed at a distance. It was the sound of a machine doing the thing it was built to do, right beside her, with no intermediate layers between her and the fact of it. Nate taxied to the threshold and ran up the engine, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on the panel, where the instruments were calm and the Garmin showed their route, the track line running south toward the gap in the mountains that was the only way through. "You okay?" Nate said, not looking at her, watching the runway. "Yes," Nora said. "You're lying," Nate said, without heat, without accusation, the way the boy had said it about the nervous standing. "Just a fact about the record." "Yes," Nora said, which was the truest answer available to her, the one that covered both things he just said, and he nodded once and turned onto the runway and pushed the throttle forward, and the 185 rolled, and then the nose came up and the grass fell away and they were in the air. The takeoff was the worst part, and then it was not. That was the thing Nora had forgotten from the wheat field, or had remembered wrong, the way fear reshapes memory to be more useful to itself, which was that the moment of lift was the violent moment, and everything after was something else. She had been braced for sustained terror. What she found, once the ground was gone and the 185 climbed into the cold Montana air, and the airstrip shrank to a thumbnail of gray in the gold and brown valley below, was not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had more to do with the fact that there was simply nothing to do. No calls, no laptop, no 12 things running in parallel. Just the mountains coming up on either side and the hum of the engine and the sky doing the things that sky does when you are in it rather than below it. Nate flew the way he did everything else, without performance, without commentary. He made a call on the radio when they crossed a reporting point, short and technical, and otherwise let the airplane do the thing it was built to do. The route went south through a gap in the range, threading between two peaks that rose several thousand feet above them, and the turbulence was light and the clouds were high, and the Garmin tracked the track line cleanly. It looked from the outside like nothing. From the inside, at 8,000 feet over the Montana Rockies in a 30-year-old Cessna, it felt to Nora Slade like the most exposed and most honest she had been in 27 years. "Your hands are on your knees," Nate said, not unkindly. He was watching the gap in the mountains. "I'm aware of where my hands are. Most people grab for something," he said. "You're fighting the urge, that's harder." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was doing the thing he always did, watching the sky, reading it. "You could have told me you knew," she said. "Knew what?" "That I'm afraid of this." She said it out loud for the first time in 27 years, not to a therapist, not to her father, not to anyone. She said it to a stranger in a small plane at 8,000 feet over mountains, and the saying of it did something to the physical weight of it in her chest. "Your son told you," she said. "Owen told me you were scared," Nate said. "He's good at that. He gets it from his mother." A pause, the kind that has something in it. "She always said you can tell everything true about a person in the first 10 minutes if you stop trying to figure out who they're trying to be and just watch who they are when something goes wrong. Smooth water, everybody's polished. Put somebody in the thing they can't control and you see them plain." He glanced at her briefly. "You laughed. A lot of people laugh at the thing they're afraid of. I've done it." "What are you afraid of?" She asked it before she decided to, which was becoming a pattern this morning. He was quiet for a moment. Below them, the trees thinned and the valley opened, and a thin silver line of river appeared, catching the noon light. "Being away," he said. "Being somewhere else when the thing happens." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Nora understood from the shape of it, from the way he said it, that there was a story in those 6 words that had reorganized his entire life. "I left the airlines over it. Some things you can't fix. Some things you can just decide you won't let happen the same way twice." "Were you a captain?" she said. He nodded, minimal. "Long haul. 11 years, he said. "I logged about 20,000 hours before I stopped counting." He adjusted the heading slightly, a small correction, automatic. "Owen's never known me as that person, only as the guy with the old Cessna." There was a flight, he told her, one specific flight, the last one, where he had sat over the Pacific in the dark, automatic pilot holding the airplane, and tried to remember what the inside of his kitchen looked like. He had been gone 16 days on a rotation, and the kitchen was a room he used every morning when he was home, and he could not picture it. He could picture the jet's instrument panel in complete detail, every annunciator and gauge, but the kitchen that held his wife and his unborn child was a blank, and that blankness had been, in the end, the complete argument. Not a crisis, not a dramatic moment, just a quiet inventory in the dark over the Pacific that came out wrong, and a certainty that arrived the way certainties do when they have been building a long time and finally reached the surface. He landed the plane. He went home. He never went back. The airline was good at the things airlines are good at, he said. Procedure, standardization, keeping the same type of thing safe across 1,000 iterations, but it had no idea what to do with a person who needed to stop standardizing. He looked at the mountains they were threading. The 185 is the opposite of that. Every approach is different. Every landing is its own judgment call. You can't fall asleep in a Cessna at low altitude in the mountains the way you can fall asleep in an autopilot at cruise, and I mean that as a compliment. It keeps you here. He paused. I needed to be kept here. After Lucy, I needed a job that didn't give me any room to be somewhere else in my head. Nora was quiet for a moment. Is that why you flew the clinic run? She said, needing to be here. I flew the clinic run, Nate said, because a nurse named Pat told me they were out of saline and I had room in the cargo hold. And then I flew it again the next month because Pat said thank you in a way that wasn't about the saline. He glanced at her. You know how some people say thank you and you can tell the thank you is a transaction, and some people say it and you can tell the thank you is the whole relationship. Pat's a second kind person. Whole relationship. A pause. It's a Tuesday morning thing now. I don't think about whether I want to do it. I just go. Some things become what you do without your permission, and you find out later that those are the things that mattered. Does that bother you? He thought about it. It used to, he said. Not anymore. There's a version of me that was extremely good at a thing that the world pays a lot to be good at, and there's the version I am now, which is his father. And the first version was never going to produce the second one by accident. It required leaving, deliberately. He paused. The world didn't think it made sense. Airline captain trades in his career and his certificate and his uniform for a beat-up 185 and a cargo run into a valley nobody's heard of. People thought I'd lost it. Had you? The corner of his mouth moved. Depends on how you define lost, he said. I lost the part that was adding up the numbers of what I was worth. I kept the part that actually knew what things were worth. Those weren't the same accounting. He looked at the mountains rising ahead at the gap they were threading, the rocks that high and close on either side would have been frightening if Nora had let herself look at them as rocks rather than as topography. Lucy called it up here math. She'd been a pilot too, not commercial, just her own plane, her own time. She said the thing about flying low and slow was that up here, everybody shows you who they are. No altitude for performance, no room for the version of yourself you've been working on. The math is just the math. He was quiet a moment. She was right. It took me a while to be someone I could afford to see plainly, but she was right. Before she spoke Lucy's name, they flew through a stretch of turbulence, light chop over a ridgeline. The kind that makes the plane feel for a moment like something alive and opinionated, rising and dipping in a way that has nothing to do with the pilot and everything to do with the air. And Nora gripped her thighs without meaning to, and then let go. Because she had been watching Nate for 40 minutes and she knew by now what hands looked like when they were managing something versus when they were simply accompanying a plane through the air, and his hands were the second kind. The chop lasted 12 seconds and ended. The aircraft flew on. That was turbulence, Nate said. I noticed, she said. Normal over a ridgeline in afternoon heating. The air goes up on the windward side and chops on the lee. You feel it, it's over, nothing changed. He paused. Most of what air does to a plane is like that. Brief, locally significant, then gone. The plane is not interested in the turbulence, it just moves through it. She looked at the mountains. They were beautiful from up here in a way that was not visible from the ground. You could see the whole shape of a range from the air, the way the peaks connected, the way the valleys ran, the long, intentional geography of a thing that took millions of years and looked from altitude like a plan. From the road, it was rocks and trees. From here, it was a comprehensible form. I have never seen these mountains before, she said. I drive through them on the ground route when the pass is open. I had no idea they looked like this. Most things look different from inside than from below, Nate said. That's either philosophy or aviation, I've never been sure which. She almost smiled at that. She was not a person who almost smiled easily. Nate, she noticed, had seen it the way he saw everything and had let it stand without comment. Lucy, Nora said, it was not a question, but it was a request, and he heard it as one. My wife, he said, Owen's mother, she died the week Owen was born. He said it with the flatness of a grief that has been spoken enough times to have lost its sharpness without losing its weight. Aneurysm, I was in the air, unreachable. He watched the gap in the mountains. She never flew this plane, I bought it after, but she's in it anyway, the way people are in things that were built by someone who loved them. He reached back without looking and touched the edge of the seat pocket, the one where the logbook lived. She kept her logbooks in a seat pocket just like that one. I still can't open them. I've tried. I carry hers with me instead, in that pocket. She logged about 800 hours before we had Owen. He paused. I'll open it someday, not yet. Nora was very still. The mountains held them in the gap, and below them the valley was opening up, the clinic's airstrip a visible pale scar in the floor of it, and the sky was enormous and pale and cold and clear. And she was sitting at 8,000 feet in a 30-year-old Cessna having the most honest conversation she had had in years, possibly decades, with a man she had laughed at 3 hours ago. My father, she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out the way things come out when altitude and honesty and the absence of a way out conspire to produce a version of a person she didn't know she was still capable of being. I was 18. We were flying together. He had a Piper, a Cherokee. The engine quit. He put it down in a wheat field. We were fine. Neither of us was hurt. She looked at her hands, still steady in her lap. I never flew with him again. I never told him why. He still flies. He's 72 and he still goes up, and he invites me every time, and I always say maybe next time, and there has never been a next time, and we have never once said out loud what happened in that field. She paused. I've been the CEO of a company that gets medicine to remote clinics, and the only way into some of those clinics is by small aircraft. And I have never personally made a single one of those deliveries because I have been very, very good at routing my life around a 27-year-old moment in a wheat field that nobody talks about. The 185 flew on. Nate did not tell her it was going to be okay. He did not tell her she should call her father. He did not offer the kind of thoughtfully calibrated advice that 27 years of avoided conversations might seem to require. He said nothing at all for a moment, letting the thing she'd said have the space it needed, and then he said, You landed, though, in the field. What? Your dad. He put it down in a wheat field. It landed. He was watching the runway ahead of them now, the approach coming up. Every landing you walk away from is a good landing. That's not optimism, that's just the definition. He landed the plane, you both walked away. The plane did what it was supposed to do. A pause. I'm not saying it wasn't terrifying. I'm saying the terrifying thing was also at the same time the thing working. Nora sat with that. The lenticulars, she said after a moment. The clouds Owen talks about, the ones that look like they're not doing anything. The most turbulent air on the mountain, Nate said. And the most beautiful, those two things are not in competition with each other up here. She was quiet for the last few miles of the approach. The clinic's airstrip was a gravel bar cut into the valley floor, just long enough for the 185 with room to spare, and Nate set it down as clean as the FBO landing. A carrier landing, no, that was wrong. Something more patient than that. A landing that simply placed the wheels where they should be without drama, which was itself a form of mastery that Nora understood, finally, had nothing to do with luck. They rolled out on the gravel and he taxied to the Tidone area at the edge of the strip. And when he cut the engine, the sudden silence was full of the sounds that had been underneath the engine the whole time. The wind in the valley, the river somewhere, the trees at the edge of the strip creaking. Nora took off her headset. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for the last 40 miles, which she would think about later, and which had something to do with the conversation, and something to do with the mountains, and something, the largest thing, to do with the 3 minutes on the tarmac at Harlan County that she had spent laughing, and the man next to her who had gone and fixed the thing instead. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He was already checking the parking brake, going through the shutdown. "Give me 20 minutes to help with the unloading," he said. "Then I'll be ready to take you back whenever." She climbed out of the plane onto the gravel in the enormous quiet of the Harlan Valley, and she stood for a moment and looked up at the sky, which was something she had not done, not really, not as itself, not as something worth looking at, since she was 17 years old in a wheat field in Oregon, and it had been the last good sky before the engine quit. It was a good sky. It was, in the way of high-altitude Montana October sky, a spectacular sky, blue and cold and impossibly clear, with a row of lenticular clouds stacked over the western range like the world's most patient geological formation, exactly the way Owen had described them, the ones that look like they're not doing anything, doing the most. She looked at them for a long time. The carry home, the resupply, took an hour. Nora worked alongside Nate and the clinic's one nurse, a woman named Pat who had apparently been expecting Nate and had not expected a CEO, and who took both in stride with the practicality of someone who has been running a one-nurse clinic in a remote valley and does not have the luxury of being thrown by anything. It was the first time in 12 years that Nora Slade had personally handled the supplies her company moved. She had thought about this sometimes, had known in the abstract that there was a gap between the spreadsheet version of what she did and the physical fact of it. But the physical fact, when she was standing in a cold clinic holding a box of epinephrine injectors and watching the nurse check them against the inventory with the focused relief of someone who has been watching the shelf go empty, was a different order of reality than the spreadsheet. She had built a company to do this. She had rooted it and staffed it and managed it and grown it for 12 years, and she had never once stood in the place where it arrived. The nurse, Pat Colby, had been at the Harlan Valley Medical Center for 18 years, long enough to have outlasted 3 physicians and 1 building renovation, and she had the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who has long since stopped expecting the world to make her job easy and has decided simply to do it anyway. She took the supply inventory from Nora with the same brisk gratitude she gave everything, checked each item against her list with a red pen, and when she got to the epinephrine injectors, she paused for just a moment, not long, a half second, and put her hand flat on the box. The same wordless gesture Nate had made on the plane's cowling, and then went on marking her list. Nora watched that moment and understood something she had not understood in 12 years of running the company that made the gesture necessary. She had built a distribution network, managed logistics, designed cold chain protocols, and hired 800 people, and she had understood all of it in terms of efficiency and margin and days on hand inventory. She had not understood, until Pat's hand on the box of epinephrine injectors, that what she was actually in the business of was making it possible for a person in a remote valley to have that half-second of relief. That was the product, not the distribution. The half-second. She had been building the infrastructure for the half-second for 12 years and had never, until now, been in the room where it happened. She and Nate ate the lunch he'd packed, sandwiches, in foil from a diner in Harlan, sitting on the plane's step in the cold valley sun. and she told him about the contractor dispute that had delayed the resupply, and he told her about the route he'd been flying for 6 years. And somewhere in the middle of both of those things, they began, without meaning to have the kind of conversation that required no preamble and no performance, the kind that happens most often at altitude or at the edge of things. When two people have been honest in the same space and the ordinary protective distance between strangers is no longer the operating assumption. Owen, Nora said, he reads the clouds. He's been at it since he was 4, Nate said. I don't know where it came from. I mentioned alto cumulus once and he asked me to say it 12 more times. He looked at the lenticulars over the range. Lucy would have loved that about him. She was a collector too, not of clouds of words. She used to write down any word she liked the sound of in a little notebook. She had 43 different words for types of light, just the words, in a column. He smiled at it, the small private smile of someone remembering something precise. I still have the notebook. Does Owen know about it? Not yet, Nate said. He'll find it when he's old enough for it to land right. Arthur's, he stopped, caught himself. I was going to say something about timing. The timing of when you give a child the true things about the person who isn't there. It has to be when they can carry it without it weighing them all the way down. He looked at the mountains. I'm still figuring that out. I probably will be for another 10 years. The return flight went differently from the trip out. Nora had expected to feel the same fear, and instead she felt, for long stretches of it, something that she would have called alert but not afraid, which was an entirely new configuration of herself in a small aircraft. She watched the mountains from the other direction. She looked at the lenticulars. She asked Nate about them, what they meant, how they formed, what a pilot did when the cloud was over a peak they needed to cross. And he told her, in the level and specific way he explained things, and she listened the way she listened to things she actually wanted to know, which was completely. They form in the wave, he said. Stable air goes over a peak and oscillates on the downwind side, and where the air rises in the wave, the moisture condenses into the cloud, and where it descends, the cloud evaporates. So the cloud sits still over the mountain, but the air inside it is moving constantly, standing in place but full of motion. He paused. Your son called it right, the ones that look like they're not doing anything. She was quiet for a moment. They're the most dangerous clouds in this airspace, she said, stating it, not asking. And the most reliable, Nate said. Once you know what they are, you know exactly where the wave turbulence is. They're honest about what they are. They just look still from the outside. She thought about that for the last 20 miles of the route. She thought about her father, who had put a plane down in a wheat field when it was necessary, and had never asked her why she didn't fly with him anymore, because the Slade family did not ask those questions, and because asking would have required her to answer. She thought about what Owen had said, the true answer is the one that works, and about what Nate had said about the lenticulars, honest about what they are, just looking still from the outside. She had been looking still from the outside for 27 years. The wave had been running through her the whole time. She called her father that night from a motel in Harlan in the dark. She had not planned to. She had planned to call her COO and her assistant and work her way through the half-dozen things the day had displaced. And she had done all of those things. And then she had sat on the edge of the motel bed for a while in the stillness that comes after a day that has rearranged something fundamental. And she had picked up her phone. And she had dialed her father's number before she could make the intelligent decision not to. He answered on the second ring. He was a prompt answerer. He had always been a prompt answerer. Nora, he said, everything all right? Yes, she said. I flew today, small plane. A silence on the line, a silence she recognized, her family's specialty, the silence of something that wants to be said and has been unsaid so long it doesn't know how to begin. How was it? Her father said. Terrifying, she said, and then not. She looked at the dark window, at the motel parking lot, at the mountains she couldn't see but knew were there, holding the lenticulars above their peaks in the dark. Dad, I need to tell you something that I should have told you 27 years ago, she told him. The whole of it, the Wheatfield version that she had been carrying since she was 18. The fear and the silence and the 27 years of routing her life around the moment. And the not asking and the not answering that had grown between them the way walls grow, stone by stone, without any single day being the day you could point to and say here. This was when we started losing the room. She told him about the clinic and the Cessna and the man who fixed his plane in 3 minutes and the conversation at 8,000 feet, and she told him what it had cost her to get into the plane and what she had found on the other side of the cost, which was not nothing, which was in fact the exact opposite of nothing. Her father was quiet on the line for a long time. Nora, he said, I have wanted to ask you about that afternoon for 27 years. I didn't ask because I thought asking would make it worse. I thought if I brought it up, I'd be asking you to relive it. I thought leaving it alone was the kindest thing." His voice had something in it she had not heard for a long time, the voice of a man setting down a thing he has been carrying. "I was wrong. I see that now. I was wrong and I'm sorry, and I would very much like to take you flying sometime if you're ever willing, not to fix anything. Just because you're my daughter and I love it up there and I always wanted you to love it too, and I ran out of nerve to ask." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. "I'll call you when I'm back," she said. "We'll figure out the when." "Good," her father said, and there was something in that single word, the relief in it, the simple gladness, that Nora Slade added to the accounting of what one day had cost her and returned. She saw Nate the following morning before she caught the shuttle back to Missoula, where the PC-12 would be repaired and waiting. He was at the airstrip with Owen, who had come along for the morning, and Owen was sitting on the wheel chock of the 185 with his notebook open, drawing the lenticulars over the range, which were stacked again in the clear dawn light, in exactly the formation they'd been in the afternoon before. "Altocumulus lenticularis," Owen said without looking up, which was apparently how he greeted people now. "I know," Nora said, which surprised Owen enough that he looked up. "I looked it up last night, the standing wave clouds." "Most people don't know that," Owen said with the evaluating air of a quality control specialist. "Most people think they're weird weather." He tilted his head. "Were you scared on the flight?" "Yes," Nora said, "at first. And then not. And then not." He nodded, filing it. "That's how most things work," he said in the tone of someone who has thought about this carefully. "Scary until you know what they are." He looked back at his notebook. "Dad says the lenticulars look still, but they're not. The whole wave is moving through them all the time. It just looks still because the cloud stays in the same place even though all the air inside it changes." He drew a careful outline. "I think lots of things are like that." Nora looked at the clouds and at the boy and at the man who had produced the boy, who was at the nose of the Cessna running through the morning pre-flight with the same patience he brought to everything. And she thought about 27 years of looking still while the wave ran through her, and about a wheat field that had been not just a landing but a thing that worked, even if she had never let herself know it until now. "Owen," she said, "is there an address where I can send you things?" "Cloud books, maybe, or a subscription to a weather service." Owen looked at his father. "You can get those," Nate said without looking up from the pre-flight. "He'd probably end up correcting them," Nora said. "The books, I mean, based on what I know of his opinions." The corner of Nate's mouth moved. "Probably," he said. She gave Owen her business card, which he held very carefully by the edges, the way you hold something you're going to add to a collection of things that matter. She shook Nate Holt's hand, and his handshake was the handshake of a man who has been using his hands for useful work and is not thinking about what a handshake communicates, which was, she had come to understand, the most reliable kind. "Thank you," she said, "for flying me, and for the—" She stopped. There was not a word for what had happened at 8,000 feet over the mountains that fit neatly into a sentence she could close. "For the conversation." "The math works better up there," Nate said. Simple, true. He climbed back into the pre-flight and she walked to the waiting shuttle and Owen called after her. "Altocumulus standing lenticular is the full name, but most people just say lenticular." "I'll remember," she said. She did. In the weeks between October and January, Nora restructured the Harlan Valley supply route. She did not make a press release about it, or put it in a board deck, or frame it as a strategic initiative. She simply pulled the route from the contractor who had let the delay run and redesigned it, building in a direct Aldous relationship with the clinic rather than a third-party handler. She hired a second field pilot for the Mountain West region, someone with backcountry experience and a tolerance for weather windows, and she wrote the job description herself, which she had not done for a hire in 8 years, because she could not write a useful description for a job she had never understood from the inside until a Tuesday in October. She also, and this was the part she could not entirely explain in business terms, but which she was no longer willing to explain away, added a line to the company's field operations protocol that had never been there before. At least quarterly, each supply route serving a remote or mountain access-only clinic will be personally visited by a member of senior leadership. It was the kind of rule that senior leadership rarely imposes on itself, and that the 800 people of Aldous Health noticed and found, in the way organizations notice things and rarely say them, significant. She came back to Harlan County 3 months later, on a January Tuesday, on the Ray-rooted Aldous Health supply run that she had, in the weeks following October, taken a personal interest in designing, and personally flew the first version of on the PC-12 she'd finally gotten repaired and released. But she called ahead, and she came early, and she was at the airstrip when Nate and Owen pulled in with the Ford, And Owen saw her from the passenger window before the truck had stopped and was out the door still moving, notebook in hand, saying, "There's a new one over the northern range. A lenticular in a double stack. I've been drawing it for an hour. Come look." And she had gone and looked. And the double stack was exactly what Owen described. The morning light on the ice crystals in the upper lens turning it briefly gold, and she had stood in the cold with a 7-year-old who collected clouds and let herself feel the specific happiness of knowing what she was looking at. It became a thing. That is the simplest way to say it, and the truest. She came back. Not every Tuesday, not regularly in a way that could be scheduled or managed, but often enough, in the way that real things come back to you when you have finally stopped routing your life around them, present, recurring, unengineered. She flew with Nate twice more that winter, on her own supply runs to the clinic. On the second flight, she asked about the logbook, Lucy's logbook, in the seat pocket, not pushing it, asking the way you ask about something you know the other person knows you're asking about. He looked at it for a moment, the level look. 48 hours, he said. That's what she logged in the first year. She was slow and careful at the start, and then she wasn't. He touched the edge of it and then left it where it was. "I'm getting closer," he said, not to Nora, to the logbook, as if setting an intention. And Nora did not say anything, because it was not her logbook, and she understood now the difference between an open door and a door that belongs to someone else, and that the most respectful thing you can do with the second kind is to let the person on the other side open it in their own time. Owen turned 8 in February. She sent a cloud atlas, a serious one, the kind used by meteorologists, the kind whose taxonomy went deep enough to satisfy a boy who had been correcting the basic books since he was 7, and a card that read simply, "The lenticulars are still doing the most. Happy birthday." He sent back a hand-drawn card with a meticulous rendering of the double-stacked cloud from January and a caption in careful printing that said, "Alto cumulus lenticularis, double stack." Drawn by Owen Holt, age 8. P.S. Your plane is too big, but it is the right shape. Nate called to apologize for the postscript. Nora told him not to, that it was the most accurate aeronautical critique she had received in 12 years of running an aviation-dependent company, and she meant it. Her father came out in the spring. He was 72, and he still had his certificate, and he still flew his Cherokee. And when he landed at Harlan County, Nora was standing at the edge of the tarmac waiting, and they stood for a moment in the way of two people who have just crossed a long, self-made distance. And then she hugged him, which was not a Slade family thing, and which they both did anyway, because 27 years was long enough. She introduced him to Nate and to Owen, and Owen immediately asked her father how many hours he had logged, and her father told him, and Owen wrote the number down in the notebook and looked up and said, "That's a lot. That means you've been scared a lot of times and kept going." And her father had looked at Owen for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been correctly diagnosed by a stranger, and then he had said, "That's exactly right, son. That's exactly what it means." She flew with her father that afternoon in his Cherokee over the mountains. The Cherokee flew differently from the 185. It felt, to Nora, slightly larger and slightly more forgiving, the way an old familiar thing feels familiar even when you are meeting it for the first time in decades. And she understood, climbing in, that some part of her had always known the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a word you have been avoiding saying. Her father flew with the practiced ease of someone who has 45 years in the air and has made peace with every kind of weather, and she sat in the right seat, the same seat, and she looked at his hands on the controls, the same hands, large and unhurried and reading the plane the way Nate's hands read the sky, as a live and variable thing that rewards attention rather than force. "You're watching my hands," her father said without looking at her. "I know," she said. "I was watching them too," he said. "In the field, the whole way down, I didn't look at anything else because if I looked at anything else, I'd have been thinking about everything that could go wrong, and if I was thinking about that, I wouldn't have been flying." He adjusted the trim, a small correction. "You know what I was thinking about those last 40 seconds on the approach to the field?" "No," she said. "You," he said. "I was thinking about you. I was thinking, the plane is fine, Nora is fine. We are going to land this in the wheat and walk out to the road, and then I am going to take my daughter for pie because we will have earned pie. That's the whole thought I had. That's all I flew on those last 40 seconds. He looked at her briefly, and his eyes were the same eyes she'd avoided for 27 years, and they were not the eyes of a man who had failed her. "I should have told you that a long time ago. I should have told you that the whole way through, the only thing I was thinking about was making sure you were fine. But I didn't tell you because I didn't know you needed to hear it, because we never talked about it, because I thought leaving it alone was kind," Nora said. "I know, we were both wrong about that." He nodded. We were both wrong about that, he said, and they flew on into the mountains, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it, because they had, after 27 years, finally said the essential thing, and the essential thing, it turned out, was not complicated. It was just the thing that had needed to be said, and was now said, and the sky above them was the same sky it had always been. It was the first time she had flown with him since the wheat field. She looked at the lenticulars as they came up over the range, the standing wave clouds, the ones that looked still but were not, and she counted the seconds between gusts the way you count the time between lightning and thunder, as a measure of the distance between yourself and the thing you feared, and discovered that the distance had closed, and that the closing was not frightening, and that the sky on the other side of the closing was the same sky that had been there her whole life. Patient and enormous and full of the specific kind of honest that Nate had tried to explain at 8,000 feet, that a place gets when you are in it rather than below it. It was not a cure, and it was not a resolution. It was a beginning of the kind that arrives after a very long time in the middle, and it was, for now, more than enough. The following October, on a Tuesday, Nate opened the logbook. He told her about it afterward, not that day but a week later, matter-of-factly, the way he told things. And she understood by then that the matter-of-factness was not distance but its opposite, that it was the way he held the things that mattered most, close enough to touch. He said he had been doing a pre-flight, the standard morning check, and he had taken the logbook out of the seat pocket to adjust something behind it, and he had held it in his hands for a moment, and the moment had turned into a longer moment, and he had sat in the left seat in the cold hangar and opened it, and he had read the 48 hours of his wife's careful logging. The dates, the weather, the departure and arrival airports, the time to climb, the short notes she made in the remarks column. Things like Needle calm today and Owen asleep in back in a log from the spring before Owen was born, and he had read all of it, sitting in the plane she never flew, in the hangar she never saw, and he had cried, and then he had put the log back in the pocket and started the engine and flown his Tuesday route. I'll leave it in the pocket, he said. I like knowing it's there, and now I know what's in it. Nora thought about what he'd said the first time they flew together. She's in it anyway, the way people are in things that were built by someone who loved them. She thought about her father's hands on the controls in the wheat field. She thought about Owen's double-stacked lenticular drawn in careful pencil on a birthday card, and about 48 logged hours in a dead woman's handwriting, and about a Cessna that looked rough and flew clean, and about a laugh that had been the wrong response to the right moment, and she thought about what it takes to build a life worth carrying through turbulence. Not the absence of it, not the routing around it, but the thing Nate Holt had found on the other side of the worst year of his. That you climb in anyway, and you read the sky honestly, and you put it down where it needs to be, and you do not confuse a good landing with an easy one. If you ask Nora Slade now what that day meant, and people do, in the version of the story that got out, the CEO who laughed at the Bush pilot's old plane and ended up depending on him to save the clinic, the versions that all got the facts about right and the meaning almost entirely wrong, she will tell you it was not about the 3 minutes. The 3 minutes were just the 3 minutes. A man who knew his airplane, fixing a thing that needed fixing, moving on. The 3 minutes were the least of it. What it was about, she will tell you, was the lenticulars. It was about the moment she stood in a cold Montana valley and looked up, truly looked, for the first time in 27 years, and understood that the clouds she had been avoiding, the standing wave clouds, the ones that look dangerous and are beautiful, the ones that look still and are full of motion, had been up there her whole life, building themselves over every peak she had rooted around, patient and honest and waiting for the morning she finally had nowhere left to root. It was about a 7-year-old who knew every cloud name and handed them out freely to anyone who stopped to ask, because a thing worth knowing is worth giving away. It was about a man who fixed his plane in 3 minutes, not to prove anything to anyone, but because the plane needed fixing and there was a clinic with 8 days of epinephrine and a woman who needed somewhere to go. And you use what you have, and you go, and up here, the math is just the math, and everybody shows you who they are, and the clouds are always, finally, honest about what they are doing. She called her father that night, and she goes flying with him now when their schedules let them, and neither of them has ever needed to say much about the wheat field, because the wheat field, it turns out, was always just a field, and the landing was always, at the same time, a thing that worked.